Hey everybody, my name is Jim Kelly and I am currently serving as the role-playing game and wargaming crew chief for Southern Fried Game Expo. In another video, I talk about wargaming and skirmish wargaming, so you might want to check out that video if you're not familiar with what a wargame is. But in this video, I want to discuss why you should be playing a wargame with your kids. Now, in that other video, I discussed the two types of wargamings. There's one I call traditional wargaming, which is more of a large-scale type where you can have anywhere from 25 to 100 miniatures on the tabletop. Those games can get quite complex. Not saying kids can't play them or learn the rules, but they typically are larger in scale, a little more expensive to get into, and the rules can be sometimes or often more complex. In this video, what I'm really going to be referring to when I say playing a war game, I'm really talking about skirmish war games. Skirmish war games are a subset of war games. They're smaller in scale. Typically, you have anywhere from 5 to 15 miniatures on the tabletop. The rules are usually less complex. The rule book is also typically less expensive. And skirmish war games are typically played faster. You can usually get a skirmish war game done in about an hour, maybe 2 hours max, versus a traditional war game, which can take 3 hours, 6 hours, long time. So let's talk about why you should be playing a skirmish war game with your kids. Now, I have 2 boys, and I'll tell you one of the biggest reasons that I like to play skirmish war games with my kids is it gets them away from the electronics. And I'm talking about iPads, iPhones, digital, video games, that kind of stuff. I'm not saying any of that is bad. I grew up on video games, and I love video games. But sometimes the video games lack the social aspect of a board game, for example, seeing your opponent across the table. So one of the key reasons that I like to play skirmish war games with my boys is the social time with them, and it also gets them away from those electronics. Another reason you should be playing skirmish war games versus, say, traditional war games with your kids is skirmish war games, there are a lot of them, and more are coming out almost every month. They're a very popular subset that have grown in popularity over the last few years. And the nice thing about skirmish war games is, depending on the theme you want to play, there is probably a skirmish war game. So if you like sci-fi, there are lots of those. If you like fantasy, there are lots of those. Now, when you get into some really odd themes, let's say you want to play Clown Bunny Ninjas. I just made that up. Clown Bunny Ninjas, you're probably not going to find a skirmish war game with Clown Bunny Ninjas as the key soldier types. But that's not to say you couldn't modify an existing game. Just be aware that if you have a genre that you would like to play that's popular, there's probably a skirmish war game or more than one for that type of genre. I mentioned the social experience. Again, getting your kids across from you playing a skirmish war game, there is downtime. You're making your moves, and you have an opportunity to listen to your child, and vice versa. When they're making their moves, you can be chatting with them. Skirmish war games aren't so serious that you cannot just have a visit session. I play skirmish war games all the time with my friends, and I would honestly say that if you recorded the conversation during that skirmish war game, probably 90% of it is just friendly banter, talking about, jobs and friends and family and things like that. Very little of it is related to the game. It is a social experience, and a lot of kids aren't getting that these days. So that's why, again, I list that as a benefit of playing a war game with your kids. One of the big things I like about playing skirmish war games is the creation of terrain for the tabletop, and you can get your kids involved in that. It's crafting, it's painting, cutting, and there's a creative aspect to it that if your children don't get enough of that, try a skirmish war game and tell them that you want them to help you build the tabletop, the buildings, the ruins, the rubble, that kind of stuff. Get craft supplies and go crazy. You will be impressed, so impressed with the creativity of your kids when you give them these simple tools and ask them to make a structure for the war game. Let's talk about a big one here for kids. I don't know about your children, but my boys don't care to read. However, when they find a game, a board game or a war game or a role-playing game that they like to play, guess what? All of a sudden, they can't read fast enough. They grab the rule book, they go get on the couch, and they start reading. And I discovered that with skirmish war games. Like, for instance, this is one called Frostgrave right here. This is one of my favorites. When I introduced this to my oldest son and we played it, I didn't have him read the rules. I explained the rules to him. But after he played a game, then he wanted to read the rules front to back so that he had a better understanding, because he knew that there were some things that I might have left out or glossed over. So he grabbed the rule book and he started reading. So if you've got a child who is sort of resistant to reading, maybe try a game. And you might be surprised that, if they're reading a rule book, guess what? They're reading. There's math involved. I mean, it's not advanced math. You're not going to be doing calculus and trigonometry. Well, okay, maybe trig. I know, I'm kidding. But, there is some math involved. It's adding and sometimes some multiplications, figuring out statistics and things like that. And I'm going a little crazy here. But people get into war games and they will examine, say, 2 types of soldiers. And they'll run the math to see which of these soldiers should I choose, which one's going to have the better odds of hitting hitting the bad guy, or firing an arrow. What are my chances of hitting at that distance versus, say, half the distance? You'll be surprised if your children get into war games like one of mine has. You'll be surprised at how they'll start running the math in their head. They're not doing advanced math, and they may hit you with some questions like, I don't know how do I know that this guy's better than this guy? These are the stats, but how do I compare them? There's a little bit of math tucked into a skirmish war game, so take what you can get and introduce your children to a war game and maybe improve their math skills a little bit. Critical thinking. This is a term that is sort of bandied about all over, but critical thinking in a war game, it exists. I mean, there's strategy here. When you really get into a war game, you're examining line of sight and angles, and you're thinking about tactics. Should my soldiers move here under cover, or should they get out and control the center of the table, even though they might be open for attack? The critical thinking aspect, especially for kids, is huge. You may not think much about it as an adult playing what you might consider a simple skirmish game, but you'd be surprised how serious children and kids will take a war game and examine it from all different angles. Kids want to win a game. I mean, let's be fair. When I play a game, I don't always care if I win. I enjoy the social and the fun part, but kids, they like to win a game. So you're going to notice an increase in their critical thinking when it comes to the rules and gameplay. Here's the thing. In school, our kids are under constant stress to do the right thing. They're bombarded with decisions constantly, and some of those decisions they have to make have real-world consequences. But in a war game, in a fictional game, they can take chances without any major risk to their person. They can take these chances and go for being the hero. They might lose, but they didn't lose something, tangible, other than maybe bragging rights. But if they win, the confidence that you will see in your kids is amazing. Again, I call it high risk attempts, low stress failure. And high risk attempts in a war game could be just gunning for a target or an objective and achieving it. But again, with a war game, it's a game. If they lose, trust me, children don't like to lose a game, but they know that it's not the end of the world. There's not a real world risk that they're going to have to deal with when they leave the tabletop. And ultimately, war games produce more family time. I mean, we talked about the social aspect and the creativity involved in crafting and things like that, but really what it comes down to is any chance that you can have to play a game, and it doesn't have to be a war game, but when you have a chance to play a game with your child, that's family time, that's visit time. And video games do allow for that, but I typically find that kids, especially my own, they're so focused and they sink so deeply into video games that there's not a lot of socializing going on with that. However, with a board game or a role-playing game or a war game, you do get that. You get that face-to-face. You can look them in the eye. They can look you in the eye. You're talking. You may be talking over the rules, but you're talking. And that's a huge one, especially in this day and age when there are so many distractions for our kids. So I hope that I've given you some strong reasons here to go and play a war game, skirmish war game, with your child. And I keep stressing skirmish war game, but a traditional war game like Warhammer 40K is going to be just as much fun with your child as a skirmish war game. And if those terms don't mean anything to you, be sure to look up the other video I have that explains the difference between traditional war games and skirmish war games. All right, that's all I have for you in this video. Again, my name is Jim Kelly. Just to give you a little background, I run a YouTube channel called The Tabletop Engineer where I make terrain for the various games, role-playing and war games that I make. And my channel just focuses on how-tos and instructions for duplicating a lot of what I do. Again, I'm also involved in Southern Fried Game Expo, so even though this year we're doing it online, I hope to see and meet all of you next year at Southern Fried Game Expo 2021. I intend to have war games and skirmish war games and role games set up around the event where those of you who've never played any of those types of games before can come up and get some hands-on experience playing an RPG or a war game. So I look forward to seeing all of you next year. Thank you for your time. I hope you learned something, and take care.